Open Tobias Harris, and Tobias drills it! Sixers up one!
Embiid fakes, Embiid down the lane!
What is going on, guys, and welcome back to the Pick Spot Podcast. My name is Sean Barnard, as usual, and here with Sam DiGiovanni of ClutchPoints, as well as doing some Phillies coverage over on Philly Sports Network. One of the best Sixers follows on the beat right now. Sam, are you feeling a little bit relieved that you have some downtime coming up now that these Sixers are toned down? What's your vibe check right now?
Man, it really is like a roller coaster when you're wrapped up in all the postseason stuff, and it just goes all the way down. So obviously, had Daryl's presser yesterday, gave us something to do for for the next few days to talk about, and ahead of what should be a really, really exciting offseason. That was pretty much the theme of Daryl's presser, and I mean, it makes sense. He's kicked the can down the road to this point, so we'll enjoy the rest of the playoffs and what the other teams are doing. Obviously, the Phillies are heating up, and I'll be having some stuff over that PSN, as you mentioned, as well as Sixers offseason stuff at ClutchPoints. But yeah, man, thank you for having me on. I'm excited to be back on. It's been a minute.
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody make sure you tap into all of that. Sam does a great job covering both teams there. And I did want to touch on exactly what you spoke about, that I mainly want to speak today, looking at the Sixers roster, who stays, who goes, which of these guys will be. I know Daryl Morey expressed that they would like pretty much all their free agents back, but that is not the way that the NBA world works. So I do want to dive into each name. But to start off with, Sam, I'll ask you first and foremost, what was your biggest takeaway from Daryl Morey's presser yesterday? That if you had to take one thing from it, what would you say that was?
So it sounds like, I mean, what he said was kind of keeping all his options open, which obviously makes sense. Like, you're at a presser like that, any GM, you're not going to give away too much unless you're Pat Riley, in which you're going to tell all your players that you hate them pretty much. That was so funny to see. And I found it interesting. They didn't stream it anywhere. It kind of makes sense why Pat Riley did not seem to be in a good mood. But anyway, with Daryl's presser, it feels like this offseason really is going to be eventful. It feels like, he's learned a good bit from some of the mistakes, some of the other things of this season, just his tenure overall. I do think that, I know a big takeaway is that he's looking for a third star, and that would be my guess as to which route he prefers to go. But I do feel like there's going to be so many options, especially, giving, whatever happens with the rest of the playoffs, that could definitely shape things for sure. He talked a lot about the change this offseason. He mentioned the four players by name the three who are under contract next year of Embiid, B-Ball, Paul, and Council, and then Tyrese, who they're obviously going to find a new contract for. Those are the guys, he said, those are the only guys who he expects to be back. And even the younger guys have non-guaranteed deals that make it easier to move them. So it does really feel like, this is setting up for, I mean, he said it himself, a lot of change this offseason. And obviously those, pressers aren't, you can't take every single thing literally. He's going to not give away his entire hand right now, but I would expect a lot of, change and for the Sixers roster to look really, really different next year.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we kind of look at the Daryl Morey tenure so far, that so much of this has been building to the summer, that this is finally the time where he's not undoing past wrongs, that he doesn't have an Al Horford contract to trade or a Tobias Harris contract logging up 28% of the salary cap, or a Ben Simmons holdout or James Harden situation. All that is now in the past, that this is now the actual time for him to paint this roster as he sees fit. And now kind of, I guess, the pressure turning up a little bit to make sure that is the case, because we know the situation with Joel Embiid as well, that window is not getting any wider. Every year is another kind of risk factor, or you never know how long that window is fully going to stay open. So I do think this is a very important summer, and I would agree that I think that was one of my larger takeaways. We know Daryl Morey from past years that he is a quote-unquote star hunter. He is a guy who likes the big names. So before we dive into the Sixers here, the popular ones seem to be Paul George, Jimmy Butler, and a little bit of Brandon Ingram love is sneaking in there. Do you have any intrigue by those three names, Sam, or your thoughts on kind of the star hunting approach in general?
I do think that, I mean, adding any one of those guys, I can see why they would make the Sixers better. But one of the things that Daryl said was, he said this in relation, I asked him about Tobias Harris, what he thinks about him, if he's going to be back. And one of the things he said Didn't mention Tobias by name in this part of his response, but did say in response to that question was that, it's important to find players who are, fit what you want, but fit in the constraints of the CBA. What he said verbatim was, quote, "It's really not, does this player help? It's, does this player help within the context of the CBA at whatever number they're at, what constraints that creates for other positions." And it feels like he, that's kind of his way of saying, I got to be really careful as to what whatever they sign a player to, what if it's Paul George, whatever they give up in the trade, if it's Ingram or Butler, that you got to be really, really careful, and you can't just, throw around money. You got to be really careful with the assets that you have. And so for those reasons, aside from any concerns on the court, I'm not too enthused by any of the additions, or at least given to the pedigree of stars to which they all are. Like, obviously those guys are well established players, Jimmy in particular, with what he's done with the Heat. But, I think there's a lot of questions as to how much money you're going to sign them to, how much money they're just going to take up, and what you're going to give up in a trade. Like, we'll start with Jimmy. Like, obviously his relationship with Joel is great, and it would be very funny to see him back after, what he did with the Heat, but he's getting up there in age. He doesn't shoot a lot of threes. And Daryl also mentioned, I think the first question he was asked by Gina Mizell, the Inquirer, was winning without Joel Embiid and what he can do. And he kind of admitted like that he dropped the ball there. Jimmy already misses so much time in the regular season. So if, he said that it's mostly focused on winning with Joel, but obviously that's an important thing. And Jimmy is not going to help there. Paul George too, with some of the injury concerns he's had over the years, and Clippers fans at least it feels like they're very, very over him. And while his shooting is helpful, if they're buying out the rest of his prime at such a high price, I think it would be pretty worrisome. Ingram too, I think the talent there is, apparent, but you're going to have to find a new contract for him because his contract is about to expire. And the question of, how much does he really raise your ability as a team, I think is fair. Like, he's obviously, a big part of what they have in New Orleans, but I think it's also fair to see what his fit would be like with Joel and Tyrese. So I do think if they get one of those, those are the big names I think Daryl could see as like a big splash, but I'm not, going over the moon. Like, if I don't have like a list going of like preferred targets, but I don't think I would put them near the top.
Yeah, and that's interesting to hear. I can talk myself into these guys, but they're not the ones that I think I have circled as perfect. Like Paul George, when you think of the prime Paul George, he's absolutely what the Sixers team needs, but that's not quite what he is anymore. And like you can see some of the competitiveness, it doesn't feel to be there all the time on the defensive end. We know the injury concerns that he has plenty as well. And I think the point you made about Jimmy is really important as well, because that to me is pretty much at the top of my list for what the game plan should be for the Sixers team this season. Is you have to find a way to keep this team afloat without being so reliant on Joel Embiid. And that's not quite Jimmy Butler, that he has his own concerns and own issues for why he's not there on a regular basis. So I think it is interesting, but there is a lot of moving parts that will be going on there. Obviously still stuff like the Paul George has to opt out of his contract and for things to occur for that even to be possible. So before we dive fully into that, let's talk about this Sixers team as a whole. So you mentioned Tobias Harris there. I know you were the guy to ask the Tobias question to Daryl Morey, to which Daryl Morey replied that Tobias Harris can absolutely still play a role on a championship team. That was a quote that scared me a little bit there. I won't lie to you. But I do think my honest assessment would be that was more or less Daryl doing the guy a favor who has been here for so long. So in my eyes, I think the writing is on the wall that Tobias Harris will not be in a Sixers uniform next year. Would you agree with that assessment, Sam?
Yeah, I think so. So when I asked Daryl, I asked him specifically, do you think Tobias Harris can be a contributing player on the championship team? So maybe that was just him trying to provide the nicest possible answer in the words that I kind of offered. So if that puts you at ease or whatever, but I didn't expect him to say no. But yeah, I think I feel like if this Tobias and the Sixers go their separate ways, it's going to be more so Tobias. It just feels like he's ready to move on. He's ready to go. He's over it. Like, I do think, all the stuff you hear about how well regarded he is in the locker room, that's not just random talk. Like, it is legitimate, but I feel like Tobias is just ready to move on, and, probably more so willing to move on than the Sixers are from him. But I think he's honestly going to be doing them a favor. Like, he's had so many chances to improve his game over the years to show that he can step up in the playoffs. It hasn't happened. And whatever continuity, obviously he has continuity with Joel and Tyrese. And again, they really seem to like him a lot. And when he gets going, he can be very effective, but it's just the inconsistencies have been too much. And even if Daryl is not as likely to throw him a max contract again, even having his production at a modest deal like $15 million, it would be tough because he's shown he can't really excel in the playoffs, and as tough as that is. So I do think I would be very surprised if Tobias is back on the Sixers. Honestly, I think it's for the best. I think he has a chance to go somewhere else, maybe secure another big payday, and have a part of his career where maybe the fan base isn't as ready to go off on it.
Yeah, I'm fully in agreement there, and I do think Daryl was being nice to kind of put the guy, paint him in positive light as he does approach his next deal. I would wholeheartedly disagree with the assessment that I think we're at the stage where Tobias Harris is not built for the bright lights of the playoffs, and he's not a bad basketball player by any means. But I think when you're thinking about optimizing the Sixers team, every decision should be based around what complements Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey, and that's just not Tobias Harris from a stylistic standpoint as a basketball player. So I do think he's over it. I do think the writing's on the wall, and I do think it is for the better that he sees the remainder out of his career in a new location. So I do think that's the biggest takeaway there. Another point that you mentioned already here, Paul Reed was mentioned by name by Daryl Morey a couple times during that press conference. And we know the situation with Paul, that he signed an offer sheet with the Utah Jazz last summer. They put an interesting clause in there where the final 2 years of the contract only become guaranteed if the Sixers, or at that point the Jazz as well, if that team had made it past the first round. The Sixers obviously matched the contract, and then the Sixers did not make it past the first round. So those 2 years are non-guaranteed. It was interesting to me to see Daryl kind of mention him by name as a part of the future plans. Do you think that's a notable takeaway there and a clear sign that Paul will continue to be with this team?
I feel like a lot of that was just mentioning that he is under contract. Like, I do think that Daryl still values him, of course, why he matched the deal. But I do feel like a lot of that is just, him mention. Like, it would be weird if he didn't mention him, even if his contract isn't totally guaranteed. And I want to throw this back to you with a question, because I feel like I have a much different, takeaway than at least some people on Sixers Twitter, is that Paul Reed seems to be like coming under fire a lot. There seems to be always conversations about, is he the right guy? Is he the right backup? And I just don't get it. He was not really great against the Knicks, which is tough because they match what he does, and they have a really good backup center in Mitchell Robinson, who's bigger and does what Paul does really well. He wasn't that great in the playoffs, which is fair to mention, even if he wasn't the sole reason they couldn't operate without Joel. He surely wasn't helping. As a starter, he really struggled a lot, but I felt like he made improvements of his game. He's under contract for pretty cheap, like $8 million, especially if the cap keeps rising, is not that much money. And he's still young, and I think a lot of people, even his biggest supporters, didn't expect him to make a big leap. They were kind of just looking at a guy who hustles a lot, is versatile on defense, is a presence on the boards, and is a fine guy to eat minutes behind Joel. So what do you kind of make of all that? And is there a reason that I'm not seeing as to why people seem to be so out on Paul now?
Yeah, so I am a Paul Reed guy in general. To kind of put my full mindset here, for starters, I think he's kind of set up for failure to be a backup center to Joel Embiid, that it's just impossible to fill those shoes when that guy steps off the floor, and we've seen that time in and time again. I personally really was pro the Paul Reed signing and having this guy as the backup center, for the reason that I think it's important to have a different style of play when Joel Embiid steps off the floor, that you're simply not going to be capable of staying afloat just having a worse Joel Embiid coming in as a backup, whether that be DeAndre Jordan or Amir Johnson or Greg Monroe or whoever you want to throw is that guy that pretended to be that. So Paul is different, that he is more switchable. He can switch 1 through 5. He is more just high energy athleticism. I think where some of the disappointment comes in is 2 main lanes here. For starters, there was a lot of the chatter leading into the year from Nick Nurse's mouth about playing him next to Joel and seeing about expanding his game. We really didn't see that happen pretty much at all. A couple brief moments here and there. And the other part that I think people soured on was during the time without Joel Embiid, seeing Mo Bamba getting these starting minutes. And I get the mindset from Nurse is likely to keep Paul within his role. I think people were left a little, I guess, not satisfied that he wasn't able to expand and step into that a little farther. I do think that he is over criticized in a general census, that I think for the most part, he wasn't this issue. And I think from my perspective, what has changed a little bit in the Joel Embiid backup look is how much offensively this team fell apart. Now, granted, that can absolutely be covered up if they bring in one of these third options, or even a season like last year where James Harden was the guy capable of generating offense and keeping this team afloat. I don't think we saw that. We saw the offense fall apart in a way different way this year during the non-Embiid minutes. So I think it's a lot of things combined. And I think, to be honest, he catches more blame than he should, if I'm being completely honest here.
Yeah, I will say, I think it's totally fair to bring in a third stringer that can compete with him as a backup minutes. There are times where he really isn't playable, where he gets into foul trouble still, obviously. So I'm not opposed to the idea of, bringing in another guy to compete with him, or to, be the backup on certain nights, just, kind of give him some competition to sort of keep him honest. But I really don't understand what people were expecting from Paul this year, that like people are suddenly like, oh, I'm out, like get him off the team. I don't understand that. He's not the perfect player, and maybe part of it is just that he is like finally a playable backup behind Joel that is young and can do other things that, like you kind of mentioned, he's like a breath of fresh air from the other guys of the past. But I don't know. I mean, I don't think Paul like needs to stick around with the Sixers, but I also don't think they need to like shop him either.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I do think people are a little too hard on him in general. But you know what? Like, as I kind of mentioned, I do think the backup center position is pretty much set up for failure when you're behind Joel Embiid, because those are just massive shoes to fill there. So we'll see. I would prefer if he's still around next year, but I do agree with you. I wouldn't mind bringing some competition as well. And I also think my final point with it is he was looked at as kind of the archetype of players that Nick Nurse has been so effective in, like further unlocking. When you think of the Chris Bouchers and the Pascal Siakams and those type of players that he dealt with up in Toronto. And Paul Reed kind of has just been Paul Reed again this year, which I think says more about Paul than anything here. But he is what he is. We got to kind of accept that at this point. So will be interesting to see if there's any movement there. I think it is more likely that he will be back next year, but we will see. The next guy that I want to shift to that I think is a little more unclear is Kelly Oubre Jr. That I think for Kelly specifically, the mindset was for this year to rebuild his value. That I think he took it as a slap in the face that he was the only player in the NBA last year to average 20 points per game and have to accept a veteran's minimum. That he came to Philadelphia to kind of prove that he can play winning basketball, and he absolutely did that. So I personally would love to see Kelly Oubre Jr. back on this roster. I'm curious how much his mindset has changed for wanting to stay in Philadelphia versus wanting to maximize dollars. So what's your feel for that, and do you think that he ultimately ends up back on these Sixers next year?
I would not be surprised if he's back with the Sixers. I do think a lot of, his willingness to adapt to what the Sixers needed him to do is just the fact that they were maybe not the only team offering money, but like the one that came in right before the season started and gave him that contract, gave him that spot to prove himself. And he obviously took it, through all the inconsistencies and the, shooting slumps. Like, he played really hard. He was very valuable on defense. I mean, the fact that they signed him a week before training camp and they made him the primary matchup for like the star on the opposing team in the playoffs shows a lot of how much he, adapted to what Nick Nurse wanted out of him and did mostly what they needed him to do, taking shots when he was open. And, through some of the moments of trying to find his own stuff, some of that was frustrating, but I mean, he did mostly what they needed him. So I do think it's interesting to see what his next contract looks like, whether it's from the Sixers or elsewhere. I do think that he's a guy that they should bring back, but maybe not at the role that they had. Like, for him to be featured so prominently, I think just speaks to Daryl, taking it easy and not going all in to, win this year, because obviously he has the eyes to build this team up for the future this offseason. So I think it would be smart of them to bring Kelly back, keep some consistency, continuity with the roster, but I think if he is starting again, like, he either needs to, like, it should be he is clearly the fifth starter, or he should just be one of the bench guys because of what he brings. It is pretty valuable, but there's other guys that can do what he does a little bit better. And I think it's, again, worth keeping around on a, multi-year deal that's not super big, but I really am curious to see how the Sixers and other teams evaluate what he did this season.
Yeah, defensively, he was so far above what my expectations were for him this year and there's certainly the head scratching and frustrating moments, a couple bad heat checks, and just not being as good of a 3-point shooter as you really would hope for this team. But the reality is, like, I have a high tolerance for guys that just compete super hard on an every night basis. And that's Kelly Oubre Jr., that he's going to flex. He's going to blow kisses to the crowd. He's going to do his thing. And you know what? He did make a positive impact on this team. I very much would love to see 6-man Kelly Oubre would be my entire pitch. When you think about how this roster is fully constructed, we'll see what it all shakes out. It would not surprise me if he does get a big contract somewhere that the Sixers aren't comfortable matching. But I also think there still are some past scars from previous Kelly Oubre seasons that might prevent teams from fully going all in there. So will be interesting to see there. Any predictions for what you kind of think that general ballpark of a value is?
I would say somewhere in like the, $10 to $15 million range seems kind of likely. Like, again, he did show what he can do, but that was all, he was signed to a minimum and all he could really do was kind of play along with what the Sixers wanted. So I think it'll be interesting to see if the Sixers believe that he can continue to be that with a more secure contract. It's kind of, I don't know, it feels kind of weird that, like, okay, we're only going to like pay you if you do this, which I guess that's how it generally works, but it feels almost weird to like hold it above his head, this payday. But I mean, Daryl was very complimentary of him. Guys throughout the year have talked about how much they, appreciated him and what he brings. But I would say if I had to guess his next contract, it would be probably, 10 to 12 or 10 to $15 million annually. Maybe not a full 4 years, but like 2 or 3 I can see.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. I saw Bobby Marks had it as a kind of in the $8 million range, which I thought was a little low. I think he probably gets more than that, and I honestly would be content if the Sixers do go higher than that. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Another guy that I think was a bit of surprise to everyone, how much he became beloved and how important he became to this team as well, Nico Batum. And there was a lot of talk about Batum when he first got here of it likely he's going to retire at the end of the season. This feels like one of those situations where it has far more to do with family than basketball, and it's clear to me, at least, that he definitely has at least another year left in those legs if he desires. Is your feeling that he's going to ride off in the sunset after the season?
I can see that for sure. He obviously is getting up there in age, and I feel like I don't know if this was reporting or just something that he or his wife mentioned of retiring after this year's Olympics. But if he does decide to stick around in the NBA, I think the Sixers will be right to bring him back. But you know, sort of, kind of like depending on Kelly, it's a little too much for Nico, and for him, it's purely just because he's getting up there in age. Like the
Yeah.
dude guarded every position you could imagine this season, and it's because he can, and Nick Nurse trusts him, which I get why. He's a super smart veteran on both ends of the floor, very versatile. But like, I just don't think you can be depending on veteran legs that much.
Mhm.
So I think if they bring him back as a bench guy or a spot starter, I think that would definitely be smart. I'm sure it would be like a little bit like maybe like a 1 year, $5 million deal or something like that. Probably more than the minimum because he is more valuable than that. It is just tough because of the retirement possibilities because he's getting up there in age, but I still think he's got it. And again, like
Yeah.
playing lesser minutes, kind of keep him fresher. Bring him back up if the playoffs, come around and he's still around. I think that would be smart. It is tough because he really is such a great player, but his career is almost over, unfortunately. And if he ends up with the Sixers on, in a bench role, I think that would be pretty good.
Yeah, I would absolutely love it. I do hope that he sticks around for another season. He is one of the probably highest IQ basketball players I've ever seen. Just some of the entry passing, the way that he places the ball, some just the little decisions throughout the game are very, and defensively, I mean, as you mentioned, like we're talking about guarding Trae Young, guarding Jason Tatum, you name it, that he pretty much did this season, which is really impressive, and a guy that certainly outplayed expectations for his role when coming to the Sixers. And we might end up remembering that trade as the Nico Batum trade, not the James Harden trade. So we'll see how that plays out there. The other trade that did come into play for the Sixers team was Buddy Hield. Now, I thought it was interesting what Daryl had to say about Buddy specifically, saying that the fit was less good than he expected, but that he could see a situation in which it still works on the Sixers depending on who the other personnel is. So for starters, what did you think of Buddy Hield's tenure with the Sixers? We saw the Game 6 explosion, but pretty underwhelming as a whole. And what do you think that means for the outlook between both him and the Sixers this offseason?
Yeah, underwhelming is right, man. He got off to such a great start, and you could see that even though he wasn't the greatest athlete, he really can shoot it, and the threat of what he can do as a shooter opens up a lot of what he can do elsewhere, driving, making plays, stuff like that. I wonder if the Sixers can be the right fit for him to kind of get him that role. Like he was playing with a lot of high tempo teams in Sacramento, Indiana, with a great playmaking point guard that could help push the pace and get him open, that kind of thing. And I wonder if the Sixers offer that. Like obviously Joel and Tyrese draw extra defenders, but that's a different setting in the half court where you have to be more willing to go around a defender to use a closeout. And I think Buddy can do that, but as we saw in the playoffs when the intensity's picked up and he's not the greatest, explosive athlete, that he can really struggle. So he's not a guy that they should like rule out, bringing back. But Daryl did also mention, I think he said this on the right, Sirki Sanchez, and like some point during the season before the trade deadline, that they're going to look for guys that they aren't necessarily like married to the idea of re-signing them right away. And I think it kind of shows why with Buddy, like he had this idea of this great shooter who could surround, help Joel and Tyrese and provide spacing and get shots up. And obviously he did that in Game 6. He was fantastic. But he just didn't do it consistently enough to where I'm pegging him as a guy they like should prioritize bringing back.
Yeah, I think that's all totally fair. I am a Buddy Hield guy that I've loved him throughout his career. He's been one of those almost Sixers for years, but it is disappointing that him in theory is not quite what he is in actuality. And the lack of athletic pop in his game to me is especially disappointing, that he really can't beat guys off the dribble. And even with the threat of his shot being as significant as it is, like he really struggled to create separation like at all in these playoffs. And even in some off ball motion, like he just wasn't able to get open at the rate that you need him to be. So I wouldn't mind like if you give it a whole season. And I'm curious, he's very much falls in the price dependent category to me, that in a perfect world, I would love getting Buddy Hield back on this team to try it throughout an entire season when you can build up a playbook alongside Joel Embiid from the start and hope that it does work better. You can create some sets to get him open in a way that I don't think Nick Nurse fully maximized him by doing that this year, but I get it's hard throwing him in midseason. So I'd be open to trying it again, but it's definitely not a guy that I think the Sixers should be rushing out to be first in line, which the way I kind of anticipated to be the case following that trade. So definitely disappointing there.
What he will, one way I know that he will live down in, in Sixers lore is that he was the player who finally granted Furkan Korkmaz's trade request. one of the great almost Sixers granting one of the greatest almost not Sixers, finally letting him go somewhere else. I really thought he would stick around in Indiana. I hope he gets back to the NBA next year.
Yeah, I do hope Furk gets a little run because I love Furkan Korkmaz, man, and pretty funny to see just the way that his tenure in Philadelphia went. But there were still the positive moments for Furkan, so shout out. I hope he's doing all right out there. Another guy that I think kind of captured the hearts of Philadelphia in a little bit of a surprising way is Cam Payne. That Cam Payne that everyone was up in arms after the Patrick Beverley deal. And I mean, now that kind of the roster is complete, I think the Kyle Lowry signing's the larger driving force of that occurring. But the bottom line was Cam Payne turned out to be a guy that changed some games in the playoffs for the Sixers team. He's unafraid of the moment. He's got like the swagger about him that's pretty infectious, and I love to see. What's your feeling on Cam Payne? I know he's spoken about wanting to be back in Philadelphia. Do you think there's a high chance of that happening?
I wouldn't say there's a high chance. Like, there's just so many different ways the Sixers can go that I doubt they're going to bring back a potential backup. I mean, definitely a backup, but like a potential second stringer, I guess, in Cam Payne. I love the Cam Payne experience. He was such a joy to cover. His energy is just so infectious, and his positivity, being upbeat, and just the way he plays. He plays really hard, and he can provide that spark on offense with his shooting, with his ability to pass and all that stuff. I just can't really see him being someone the Sixers shell out a lot to go get. I mean, I'm pretty sure just a minimum contract guy with Milwaukee last year. Maybe he's going to get a little bit more money somewhere, whether it's the Sixers or elsewhere. I think it would be great to bring him back. I think he's a really solid player, but I can definitely see the Sixers having other priorities and letting him get, if another team wants a veteran point guard and they're willing to give him, a little bit more money, I can definitely see that being the case where he ends up. So I would be a little surprised if he's back in Philly, but I would be very happy for him to stay.
Interesting. Yeah. I personally would love to have him back. That I've enjoyed the Cam Payne experience far more than I expected. And I do think it's important to have guys that are just unafraid and kind of that fringe of the rotation. And that's exactly what he is. That in plenty of situations, we've seen guys on the Sixers team look like the moment is a little too big for them in spots where you can't have that. You're never going to get that with Cam Payne, that he's going to be a guy go down swinging. He's going to let it rip. And we saw that there was very much when he was on the court, it gave the tone of like, you should have been playing me all along, which I love to see in an athlete from him. So I would be happy if the Cam Payne experience continues here, but I do think that obviously there's bigger fish they got to worry about before taking that in. Now, I do think that there's a couple more difficult conversations to have as far as what the outlook is for these guys. And the forefront of that list for me is DeAnthony Melton. DeAnthony Melton, from a skill set standpoint, I absolutely love him. I do think those back injuries are real deal concerning. And at the minimum, I think cost him a significant amount of money this offseason. At the maximum, I think could be concerning to the outlook for his career. So what are you hearing from a health standpoint for DeAnthony Melton? And how do you think that impacts the market for him in free agency?
What he said at his exit interview was that he has a better idea of how to get through a full season, that he's going to work, a lot of strength training in not just his back area, but his hamstrings and just, his overall body as well, to make sure that he can stay upright, because he really can be an impactful player. And I'm sure the Sixers want to, keep him after seeing the chemistry he generated with guys, namely Tyrese, and the fact that they gave up a first-round pick for him. So they obviously would like to have him for more than 2 years. He's also pretty young. But yeah, man, those back injuries really are tough. And as we saw at the back end of this season, that they can just flare up randomly. And try as he did to keep coming back, like, it was just really tough to see him go up and down. So he obviously isn't going to be down out too long. Like, he's obviously going to do what he can to stay healthy, but it is pretty tough. And I will say, although he does have the 3-and-D skill set that's pretty valuable. He's also a really small wing, and I think that size is really important to winning in today's game. Like, you look at the Timberwolves are like the shining example of it. That's hard to get to, but you see the size and what they're able to do with against the Nuggets. Like, they're really, really good on defense because they have so many big guys who can contribute. And although D'Anthony, I think, has the talent, like, I think that, unless he's going to be the like smallest guard in a lineup where Joel is just bringing the ball up a lot, I do question like how viable it is for a super small two guard like that essentially to be a big part on a really good team. So if he is back with the Sixers, I don't think it would be necessarily a bad thing, but I do kind of question if he can be a starter or if he can be like a super high minute bench guy. Just putting aside the injuries, obviously we always hope that he's okay, and if his injury, hopefully that what he's able to do this offseason does allow him to escape at least the issues that keep him out for months at a time. But I do think if he's back with the Sixers, they should look to fortify the starting lineup with not like the biggest guys possible, but more bigger guys, and bring D'Anthony off the bench and use him in more spot situations.
Yeah, and that's very interesting thoughts there. I like Anthony Melton quite a bit. I think from a shooting perspective, he's turned himself into a far more willing 3-point shooter. The quick kind of catch and shoot ability that he possesses, and really just kind of ability to let it fly and willingness to shoot it was really impressive for me. The frustrations with the finishing around the rim are legitimate as well. We saw plenty of that during his tenure here, but he is a guy that I think still can play some high level, just at least rotational minutes on a team. And even with him being a little bit smaller of size, that he does have the long wingspan, and I think is held up pretty solid trying to guard bigger defenders. But I definitely hear you, and the Timberwolves are absolutely the shining example right now of how disruptive they can be when having as many switchable, long, athletic wings as they have. We see teams like the Celtics kind of doing something similar, so that's definitely the trend into.
Sorry, even the Sixers kind of too. They had
Yeah.
lineups throughout this postseason where it was Tyrese, Kelly, Nico, Tobias, and Joel, and like obviously for the frustrations that we've seen with Tobias and even sometimes with like Kelly, sometimes just having that size on the wing is super super valuable, and I feel like it really worked at times around the Knicks. So that it's not that D'Anthony can't play because he's not a super big for his position, but I do think that when the margins get smaller in the playoffs, those type of things matter. The outlier traits really kind of matter. So again, it's not ruling out D'Anthony coming back to the Sixers, but I think he would probably be best suited off the bench for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting there. And a guy that to kind of fit this exact mold, but I think carries some similar injury concerns, is Robert Covington here. That I was so thrilled with Robert Covington coming back to Philadelphia. I even thought he looked good during the moments in which he was on the floor, but we did not see a lot of it. He did suffer a bone bruise that kept him out for quite the long period of time, and really not a ton of updates or acknowledgments for what's the situation with Covington throughout the year. So what's your feel from him from a health standpoint, and what do you think the chances are that he's back in Philadelphia?
It was really tough, man. I feel like Nurse was probably could have been better off playing him a little more when he was healthy. It felt like he
Yeah.
was, one of the, best deflection guys in the league, was having probably a career year in that rate, even in albeit not super big minutes. And he was, providing value on offense too. But yeah, man, that knee issue really, really, it didn't, I don't want to say it came out of nowhere totally, but the severity of it, I
Yeah.
think, caught us off guard a lot as we continued to get down the months in January, February, at March, like, and yeah, I can't speak to if he's going to be back. I mean, he's not a bad guy to have on your team. He fits a lot of different contexts, but kind of similar to like campaign. It's like, is that he really going to be a priority for the Sixers? Even though it was awesome to have him back and he did look really good when he was on the floor, I can see, maybe another team if he can get his knee issue corrected. And I'm trying to remember the last time Nick talked about it. It was some point during the playoffs, or maybe right at the end of the regular season, where he just sounded pessimistic about his chances. And obviously, it played out. Like, he never even got upgraded to questionable, like D'Anthony eventually did. Really
Yeah.
tough situation there, and obviously,
The one quote
sorry,
that stood out to me from Nurse when talking about Covington, and this was before him even being fully shut down, was just, quote, "There is no light at the end of the tunnel for Covington."
yeah,
And I
that's
was just like,
such an ominous
"Geez."
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, really ominous stuff, man. Again, he was super valuable as a role player when he was on the court. It is tough too, just with that and him getting up there in age. So if he is back, it would be awesome. But I wouldn't be, like I mentioned, I don't think he's going to be a super big priority for the Sixers to bring back.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I would absolutely love him back on a minimum. That would be my ideal world for Covington. I think if he's healthy, that he plays above what that value would be. But I think the health concerns are legitimate, and that's something that he's not getting any younger. He is a guy that we know the process ties and the Joel Embiid ties back in the day, which I think does help everyone in this case. So I do hope that Covington is back on this roster. But I'm very disappointed that kind of this is how we have to remember him for this year, because I do think there is a world where he makes a significant impact in the playoffs if he was healthy. So frustrating that that did not get to show face. Another guy that I did want to bring up here is Kyle Lowry. Lowry's another guy where very clearly at the end of his NBA career, very clearly a Nick Nurse guy. He's not a dude. I think he's a guy that his role became much larger than anyone anticipated, with a lot of that due to the DeAnthony Melton injury for sure. What do you think the outlook is? Do you think he plans to play another season? Will he ride off in the sunset? And is that next season, if it does occur, going to end up in Philadelphia?
I think I would, if I had to guess, the two biggest options on Lowry's mind, it's retire and play for the Sixers in some order. Like, I do feel like he really does want to stay here. He spoke very openly about how when he first signed with the Sixers, that like earlier in his career he was very wary about playing for Philly, playing so close to home and all that pressure. And then he said that it was a dream come true after he kind of got around to the idea. And I think he really obviously relished being a Sixer, playing with Nurse again, playing with Joel and Tyrese and the talents that they have. Like, he spoke very highly about them, of course. So I can definitely see him back, but probably not as a starter. Same sort of thing I said with Nico. Like, you just gotta pace those old legs more,
Yeah.
and especially for Kyle, who's a smaller guard with not a lot of lift. Like, obviously his physicality, his IQ makes him versatile and can play a lot of different roles. But at I'm not sure what age he's off the top of my head, but he is getting up there in
38.
age. So
Yeah.
38, yeah, that's for someone as short as him to continue playing is super, super impressive. And I think he can definitely be valuable as like you know, a back end bench piece. I just question if he would take that role, but yeah, I think the Sixers bringing him back wouldn't be a bad thing. But I think if they expect him to be a starter for the entire season, that would be a little rich.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. I would not mind having him back on this roster, but I don't think he's a guy that you can count on for high level expectations, especially come playoff time. I do think, like, throughout the regular season specifically, he's probably better suited in kind of like a fourth guard type role, and that there are games that you rely on him and games where he probably doesn't play at all just to save his legs and for at this point in his career. But he still does enough from just a mindset standpoint, having the IQ, being in the right place, making the right decisions, that it would not mind having around. And another great guy to just have surrounding Tyrese Maxey as you look at his potential progression, all those things. So it would be interesting to see there. Not a guy that I think that there should be too much thought over. It's kind of in his court, I guess, would be the decision there. There's two more guys that I want to hit on. One of them I think is a pretty closed door, and that would be Mo Bamba, that I think I don't expect to see the Mo Bamba experience again in Philadelphia. Do you think that's fair to assess?
Yeah, for sure. I think if they're looking for another uh, backup big, they would probably look for someone more than Mo for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't think we got to go too in
Not
depth
much to
on that
say.
one.
There's just it's time to move on.
Yeah, and to Mo's credit, he seemed like a great locker room guy, great teammate. He was always a guy that I did notice being the first guy to lift up a teammate, hyping up guys. So I don't have any hate in my heart toward Mo Bamba, but I do think left a little bit desired in the actual basketball categories, which is unfortunate there. Another guy that I think there's a little bit deeper conversation to have about is KJ Martin. That KJ was another guy that came in that James Harden trade. I was a pretty anti KJ Martin guy for most of his tenure, and he really kind of grew on me throughout the end of the season specifically. Thought he did a really nice job learning to play within his role, make some smart, high IQ basketball decisions, and he still got some raw, intriguing athleticism. Still very young, even though it feels like he's been around for a little bit now. What do you think of KJ Martin? Do you think he has a chance of coming back to Philadelphia, or do you think he will get an appealing offer elsewhere that he would prefer?
I think the second option seems more likely. I don't think he ruled out the Sixers. He was asked pretty, point blank about, do you want to come back? And he actually had a pretty lengthy response of trying to see what's best for him, trying to take advantage of the fact that he's still young and a free agent. So I do think there's a team out there that they're looking for, some athletic juice, some, like you said, some smart passing. His passing out of the short
Short
roll or
roll.
just off
Yeah.
of a cut looked really, really good. His shooting, interestingly, kind of like evaded him. Like, he was a decent shooter with Houston, and he was not very much that with the Sixers. But if he gets that back and he remains, obviously the versatile defender that he can be, just the smart heads up player, I can definitely see a team looking for a cheap bench piece and offering him more than the Sixers. So kind of like we've been saying with some of these guys, like he's a guy that I can see being back because the Sixers value him, but I can also see another team valuing him more and him just going there. Like it was, the opportunities that he got as the small ball 5 or as the 4, like I think he was pretty decently impressive, even if there were some frustrating moments. Like I said, the shooting kind of not being as prevalent as it was in Houston, and part of that was probably just because the contexts were so different. Yeah, I mean, if he's back with the Sixers, he could serve a nice, role as a bench piece for sure. But I definitely can see another team offering him, if not more money, just a multi-year deal, trying to tap into his potential, and he's elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's probably the likely case. It's not the ideal situation for him here in Philly. That is such a win now team that I still think he could use to play through some growing pains in a way that he isn't quite capable of doing or isn't the situation for him there. But I have a far more positive view of KJ Martin than I kind of expected to be the case throughout the season. That I ended up really liking the way that he played, the IQ that he played with, and I do think that he can help a team. So we'll be rooting for him wherever he ends up there. I think that's pretty much it from the Sixers side of things. I did just kind of want to ask, so Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid are obviously the stars, the building blocks, the foundation, however you want to put it. You kind of teased the conversation about building all these long athletic wings. It feels like that is the route. Would you say that is the number one priority for this team this offseason is to build out the wing?
For sure. And Daryl mentioned specifically a wing who can deliver at a high level in the playoffs. And that obviously makes sense. And that kind of hints towards a star. I think it'll be interesting to see. A lot of people I feel like I saw ruling out like Paul George and stuff because, he never comes through in the playoffs. But, it kind of depends on what playoffs you're looking at. Like he has had his moments, obviously.
Yeah.
And so I think it'll be interesting to see, Daryl will be speaking with his actions of who he gets as who he thinks can be that guy that delivers in the playoffs. One name that I'm looking out for, I think, is a dark horse, very unlikely to be moved, but it's a Pelican. And it's not Brandon Ingram. It's Trey Murphy III, who has yet to be signed to an extension. I think the Pelicans would be very dumb to let him go. They should prioritize him, but if they end up deciding that they want to keep Brandon Ingram, and they don't have enough money to pay Trey Murphy and he becomes expendable, I think he'll be a great addition for the Sixers. He's a very tall shooter, super athletic, can guard a lot of positions. And I think guys like that, guys who like Nico Batum are smart, playmakers that can either if they're connected passers or they're just able to, get the ball around, use Joel and Tyrese as, the scoring weapons rather than them creating everything and them covering, drawing the defense, passing it out. Like as much as they're going to have the ball and they should be used as playmakers because of their scoring gravity, you want the opposite to be true too because they're fantastic scorers. One of the things that it made sense why Tyrese didn't get as much catch and shoot looks as he did in previous years. Obviously, playing with guys like Harden helped, but giving him more off ball, reps. I think he's such a great spot up shooter, and his speed is really, really weaponized when someone is closing out on him, and he just blows right by them and collapses the defense like that. So having a guy like that who can, help out. Maybe Trey Murphy doesn't fit that role specifically, but he fits the mold of a guy who can play high minutes in the playoffs, can shoot the ball really well, space the floor so that when Joel and Tyrese are attacking, it's harder for defenses to send to. I do think that, again, like I mentioned, size is really important. So I think if they bring Kelly back, it would be nice to use him as more of like a 2 or 3 than more of like a pure 3, which he did at times, but not super consistently. It just makes sense, obviously, to build out the wing when you have a star guard and a star big. So I think it makes sense for him to, and obviously there's plenty of options out there. So I'm very interested to see who Daryl pursues and who ends up being a Sixer this year.
Definitely. And Trey Murphy would be an awesome name. I would absolutely love that. That's like a 10 out of 10 fit for this team. I think my view is likely that the Pelicans are prioritizing Murphy over Ingram, which is interesting in itself. But we'll see how that all plays itself. We know Ingram going into the last year of his contract as well. The last kind of question I'll throw at you before we get off here. Morey also spoke a little more highly about the concept of the draft than I expected yesterday with the number 16 pick. It's felt to me like this is pretty much going to be ammo in whatever trade that occurs. But I will say, as a guy that has already planted his flag on Jared McCain Island here, that would love to see him in a Sixers uniform. Do you think there's a chance that they end up just using that pick?
I think there's a chance, but I think it's very small. Daryl obviously talked about how he likes the draft, how he likes the guys who could be there at 16, but I would be really surprised if that pick isn't used in a trade at some point. I just think that with what the Sixers are looking to do, that it makes sense to use that asset to, throw in for a trade or whatever it may be, even if it's to draft the guy and use him in a trade later, like they ended up doing with Landry Shamet, I believe. They traded him his rookie year, right? In the Tobias trade, yeah. So
he's been
I think
everywhere.
whoever he has been everywhere. He's one of the guys who his list of teammates is like Hall of Famer, a bunch of stars. So I mean, I think there are good guys at 16. It depends on how the draft shakes out. I was actually writing about that earlier today. That you've got guys like Dalton Knecht, Johnny Furphy, those wings who can really shoot. I do like the idea of a guy like Jared McCain or Devin Carter having more young guard depth, but I would be really surprised if obviously they have to wait to trade or at least agree to the trade after the pick is made because of I think it's the Stepien rule. But I would be really surprised if they hold on to that pick and draft that player with the intention of bringing them into the fold.
Yeah, very fair. So interesting offseason ahead for the Sixers team. Sam, I can't thank you enough for popping on. What else you got going on over at ClutchPoints, Philly Sports Network, and anything else you want to plug?
Yeah, man, I got plenty of offseason stuff coming up for ClutchPoints about the Sixers. It should be obviously super interesting once we really get into it. I'll be covering the Phillies for PSN. I should be down there at plenty of the games. It's not going to be on a beat status like I am for the Sixers with ClutchPoints, but I'll be down there here and there checking out the scene, covering what is right now the best team in baseball. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. I've also got a Sixers podcast going with PSN, still processing with my guys Zach Chavalella and Justin Crosby. So check out that for sure after listening to this, of course. Yeah, man, that's what I got going on. Sean, thank you so much for having me, man. It's great to talk again, and I'm very excited to see what happens over the next few months with the Sixers, man. There's unpredictability for the offseason, but it could be a good thing. We obviously have to see. Could be, could not be, but a lot will be happening. That is for sure.
For sure. And definitely make sure to check out all that Sam is doing and the great guys, Zach and Justin over there at PSN. So make sure to tap into that. Appreciate each and every one of you guys tuning into this video here. Make sure that you are smashing that subscribe button if you have not already. Drop a like and any comments that you do have. We talk with you next time right here on Pick Swap Media. Peace.